We go. Okay, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, and you can see the screen okay. Great. Okay, so I'm Nick Hardy. I'm Pensions Officer for the UCU branch here. Being Pensions Officer doesn't mean that I'm a financial expert or professional. I'm just here to inform members and also negotiate with employers on pensions. I'm going to spend about 25 minutes talking, and then we'll have about 25 minutes or so for questions. Lots of questions, whatever you feel like asking. I'm hoping this talk will be useful for anyone who hasn't really followed the USS dispute, but also for people who have followed it. For those of you who haven't followed, it's meant to be a fairly accessible, non-technical introduction to what's happened. And for those of you who have followed it, there will still be a few nuggets of probably more up-to-date information than you've received from anyone else so far. So we should all by now, if we're USS members, have received an email passed on to us by the university about contribution increases to our USS pension contributions. What will these increases involve? Well, since 2014 up to 2017, members of USS have been obliged to sacrifice 8% of their salary up to a threshold of £55,000. And that threshold has been increasing in line with inflation and is now just over £57,000. And at the same time, employers have been obliged to make contributions equaling 18% of the same member's salary up to £55,000 and rising. So the total contribution rate from 2014 to 2017 has been 26% of salary. I'm just going to point something funny out on this table which we've been given by USS, and you'll have seen if you've read the emails and clicked through. If you look at the proportions of the 8% and the 18% in that bar, I don't know about you, but it doesn't look like it actually is 18% of that bar. USS has rather bizarrely minimised the apparent size of the members' contribution to the pension scheme and made it look like the employer's contribution, just in visual terms, is much bigger than it really is. And that should give us an idea and sort of a taste of the slightly confusing and opaque and sometimes misleading ways in which USS has communicated with its members, and even with its sponsoring employers as well. But anyway, from April onwards, so from Monday onwards, that contribution rate, 26%, is going to start increasing. It's going to increase 3 times. From April up to October this year, it will go up to 8.8% for members, 19.5% for employers. From October to April 2020, it will be 10.4% for members, 22.5% for employers. And from April 2020 onwards, it will be 11.4% for members, 24.2% for employers. And at the same time, the value of the pension payments you're going to get in retirement, corresponding to those contributions, is not changing. You're paying more money in, but you will get exactly the same benefits out as you were promised when the rate was 26%. So just a kind of a bit of modelling. In my case, as a recently appointed lecturer in this university, a couple of spine points above the bottom of grade 8. From April to October, I'll be paying £29 per month, more than I do at present. From October to April 2020, £87 more per month. And from April 2020 onwards, £123 more per month. Why is this happening? Well, the first answer USS give to this question in their communications is that simply the cost of providing pensions has gone up. Pensions have got more expensive. This isn't true of all pensions, however. It's true of the particular type of pension which USS offer on salary up to £57,000. This is called a defined benefit pension. It means that USS promise to pay members a certain amount in the future, usually when they retire, based on the number of years they spend in the scheme and the salary they earn. What this means is that USS need to work out how much money the scheme will need in the future to make the payments that are being promised to members, and they need to be confident that there's hardly any risk of falling short. How they make that calculation is an extremely complex and controversial area of actuarial science and financial economics. One of the things USS are concealing when they say the cost of pensions is going up is that they've made a lot of subjective decisions about how to calculate the cost of pensions, decisions which a lot of other experts have disagreed with, as we're going to see. But the logic of USS's argument is that if you're promising a defined benefit pension to members and your calculations tell you that pension's getting more expensive, you have to increase the amount you're asking members and employers to contribute now in order to make sure you'll be able to cover your costs. Is there anything which USS and their sponsoring employers could do or could have done in the past to avoid these increases? Well, the answer is yes. There are several things they could have done. Every 3 years, USS conduct an actuarial valuation of the scheme where they work out how much money is needed to cover the cost of the pension payments they're promising to members. The contribution increases we're about to be hit by on Monday are the outcome of the 2017 valuation. Over the course of the 3-year valuation cycle, USS conduct consultations with employers, giving them advance warning if costs look likely to increase, and asking them for input on how changes to the scheme's funding position might affect their own business model. USS don't conduct any equivalent consultations with members. Employers have basically all the power and influence. Employers also have more influence over USS's own internal decision-making and governance because employers appoint 4 trustees to the USS Trustee Board, whereas members via UCU only appoint 3. During each valuation cycle, employers get opportunities to query and even challenge the way that USS calculate the cost of their pension promises. Employers can ask USS to change the methods and assumptions they're using to calculate their costs. If employers think USS's projections are too pessimistic, they can ask USS to be less pessimistic, with the result that the costs will be lower. Alternatively, employers can offset USS's pessimism by increasing their own risk appetite, i.e. the amount of risk they're willing to let USS take in the way they fund the scheme. Employers can tell USS they want to take more risk as long as they are willing, employers are willing, to commit to making up for any potential funding shortfall in the future that occurs as a result of that increased risk. But there's a third option available to employers. Instead of trying to get USS to lower their costs or increasing their own risk appetite, employers can cut member benefits. In other words, they can ask USS to reduce the amount which they are promising to pay to members in the future. There are various ways of doing this. They can reduce that £57,000 threshold up to which pensions are guaranteed. They can cap the amount of adjustment for inflation, which is applied to pension promises. They can simply reduce what's known as the accrual rate, which is the portion of your earned salary you're promised in retirement. These are the options: challenging USS, changing risk appetite, or cutting benefits. So what actually happened over the course of the 2017 valuation, and how did we end up with contribution increases as the outcome? The answer is that only one stakeholder tried to challenge USS's calculations, really, and that was the members via UCU. UCU and their professional actuarial advisors, First Actuarial, have been criticising various aspects of USS's valuation methodology for years, and 2017 was no exception. UCU raised a number of queries and objections. However, because employers largely refused to support them or press USS to respond to them, USS were able to stick to their guns. At the same time, employers were not interested in increasing their own risk appetite to balance out USS's pessimism. In fact, employers actually reduced their stated risk appetite for the 2017 valuation, which caused USS to make the contribution rate even higher. So employers were left with 2 options for for dealing with the proposed contribution increases, either accept them or cut benefits. And they cut benefits. But they took an approach which was much more radical than any of the options I just outlined. Instead of making a few tweaks here and there, they simply proposed to end defined benefits altogether. After this valuation, employers would continue to pay money into USS, but from now on, there would be no guarantee about the payments members would receive in the future. The scheme would change from a defined benefit scheme to a defined contribution, DC scheme, where the only thing that's definite is the amount you put in, not the amount you get out at the end. With defined contribution, in other words, you can't be nearly as confident about the amount of money you'll receive in retirement. Not only this, but you're also likely, all other things being equal, to receive much less money than you would from a defined benefit scheme. This is basically because the money that goes into your pension pot is individually quarantined. It's yours and yours alone, although USS invests it on your behalf. Your money is no longer pooled together with the contributions of hundreds of thousands of other USS members, past and present, and this makes defined contribution much less efficient as an investment vehicle. In practice, if the employer's proposed move to DC had gone through, the average USS member would have lost a very large amount of money. Taking myself as an example again, I've been a USS member since 2012, spending 5 years on a relatively low postdoctoral salary and starting in 2017 on a lecturer salary at the age of 30. I was projected to lose a total of £340,000 under the employer proposal, about a third of my pension pot in retirement. And don't forget that of the 2/3 of the pot that remained, very little of it would have been guaranteed in the way defined benefit income would be. You don't want to be living through another global financial crisis when you reach retirement age if you're in a DC scheme. So out of all the options employers had at their disposal, they went for the most extreme one. As well as costing individual members tens or hundreds of thousands of pounds, it would also absolve employers of all responsibility for guaranteeing members' pension payments in retirement in the way they had done in the past. If our employers had got their way, from April onwards, you would no longer be earning a guaranteed retirement income. Why did employers try to close the DB section of USS? Well, employers' motivations for making this proposal have become pretty clear. As you know, over the last decade or so, employers have been choosing to spend a lower and lower proportion of their income on staff. They've cut pay in real terms almost every year since the financial crisis, and they'd already cut pension benefits in the previous 2 valuation cycles in 2011 and 2014. At the same time, they've been increasing the proportion they allocate to capital expenditure on things like expensive new buildings and overseas campuses. Now, to undertake these big capital projects, they generally need to borrow lots of money. But because of the way pension promises are accounted for, it's actually harder to borrow money while you're running a defined benefit scheme for staff. So they had a clear reason to get rid of guaranteed pensions. And in that sense, USS's pessimism actually suited them. The unusually high cost of the 2017 valuation gave them a pretext for saying the scheme was in crisis and pensions had become completely unaffordable. The employer proposal to end defined benefit was actually passed in January 2018 by USS's Joint Negotiating Committee. The employer negotiators voted for it, the member-elected negotiators obviously voted against, but the independent chair, Sir Andrew Cuby, cast his deciding vote in favour of the proposal. So why aren't we about to be transferred to a DC scheme? Well, I suspect you're all aware of the reason. It's because in February and March 2018, members of UCU in 61 institutions went on strike. The strike lasted 2 weeks, and in terms of its length and number of participants, it was the largest in the history of the UK higher education sector. Towards the end of the strike period, employers agreed not to close the scheme or make any cuts to benefits for the time being. Instead, they would form a joint expert panel, or JEP, consisting of 3 pensions experts chosen by employers, 3 chosen by UCU, and a chair agreed on by both parties. The purpose of the panel was to reconsider USS's valuation methods and assumptions, including the many criticisms members had made, and which employers had previously ignored during the 2017 valuation. If the panel found that USS's required costs were unnecessarily high, employers would endeavour to convince USS to lower them, rather than cutting benefits instead. After meeting, gathering information and deliberating for several months, the panel issued a report in September 2018, and the report completely vindicated members. It showed that USS's calculations were unnecessarily pessimistic and even in places incoherent. It severely criticised USS and pointed to a number of failings in the way USS had consulted employers on the valuation. The report suggested the scheme was in need of a thorough overhaul, not just in terms of its actuarial assumptions, but also in terms of the way the scheme as a whole is governed. But members and employers had already agreed that the bigger overhaul would need to be kept back for a second phase of the JEP's work, which is ongoing now. For now, in September 2018, the important thing was to find a way forward for the 2017 valuation, which was already overdue. So the specific recommendations which the JEP report made for this valuation cycle were pretty modest in order to achieve a speedy resolution. Nonetheless, despite not being as comprehensive as they might have been, these recommendations would still be enough on their own to completely eliminate the need for any contribution increases above 26% if applied in conjunction with the most recent 2018 data. There was one other small thing I'll just mention in passing that happened after the JEP issued its first report, which you may have seen. I say small, but it was reported in the Financial Times. In October, USS finally released some data on cash flow projections to one of UCU's elected negotiators, Sam Marsh, at the University of Sheffield. Marsh had requested it more than a year previously through his employer. Marsh used the data to show that USS could satisfy all its criteria for covering its future pension promises without having to raise its contribution rate above 26% at all. And this was without also implementing any of the JEP's recommendations either, so it was on top of what the JEP had said. The only reason USS needed to increase contributions was to cover alleged but not very well documented short-term risks, and also to pay for an expensive investment strategy known as de-risking, which it had wrongly assumed was necessary to cover its costs. So questions have been raised, but still not answered, about why USS failed to release the underlying data to Marsh for more than a year until it was too late to make any changes to the valuation. But the natural question to ask next is if this is what happened, if the JEP reported and reached these conclusions and employers accepted them, why are we still facing contribution increases? Well, members are happy with the JEP's recommendations. Employers say they're also happy with them. Why are they still about to go up? This is where it gets a bit complicated. The reason is that basically, while employers and members were setting up the JEP, USS decided to invoke a clause in the scheme rules that allowed them to impose the contribution increases from the 2017 valuation unilaterally if employers and members had failed to reach an agreement. So employers and members wanted USS to wait and keep the 26% contribution rate until the JEP report could be implemented, but USS said that they couldn't wait. USS triggered the contribution increases last summer while the JEP was still meeting, and they've been scheduled ever since then to start in April. In the meantime, USS agreed to undertake a new valuation dated 2018 and consider the JEP recommendations which members and employers had already accepted. The idea was that if all parties could reach a new agreement on contributions and benefits, it might at least be possible to implement it in time to avoid the next phase of contribution increases from October onwards. That might still be possible, but it's looking a lot less likely, And the simple reason is that USS have refused to accept all the JEP's recommendations. I won't get into the technicalities of exactly what USS have and haven't accepted because things are currently moving very quickly. But the best way to summarise it is using a comment which some colleagues and I, under the guise of the initiative USS briefs, provided to the Financial Times, which was quoted in the FT, which is that USS have dismissed the JET proposals that would require it to admit it had got aspects of the 2017 valuation wrong. Those are the ones that they've refused to accept. In order to justify their position, USS claimed that accepting all the JEP's recommendations would involve too much risk. This is despite the fact that the pensions experts on the JEP deem their recommendations to fall within what's permitted by current regulation, and the professional actuarial advisors to UCU and Universities UK have all confirmed that they would be willing to certify a valuation based on the JEP. There's now broad expert consensus in favour of the JEP and against USS. USS have tried to defend themselves by falling back on the pensions regulator, arguing that the regulator uses a system of risk benchmarking against other pension schemes that would have forced it to prevent USS from implementing all the JEP recommendations. Again, USS provided no evidence for this claim, and in fact they've turned out to be wrong. In its most recent survey of the schemes it regulates, published a few weeks ago, the regulator explicitly contradicted USS by denying that it uses the benchmarking system which USS attributed to it. I'm just at this point going to offer a partial qualification of what I'm saying, which is that the regulator has once or twice caused some real problems for USS by putting up genuine resistance to proposals to lower the contribution rate. In particular, it's written 2 letters to USS at crucial points in the valuation process, insisting that USS should refrain from making more optimistic assumptions about the future growth of the scheme. However, both of these letters have rested on claims about the future growth of the scheme in the higher education sector, which were disproven by the JEP's first report. So the regulator still has a lot of questions to answer about its interventions, and USS could easily push back against the regulator's arguments if they wanted to. Overall, the fact is that no one's come out of the USS dispute and the JEP report with their reputation intact, except for scheme members. As the Financial Times' in-house pensions reporter, Josephine Cumbo, put it, I think, most succinctly and accurately, the JEP's criticisms of USS and UUK, Universities UK, and TPR were serious. It's understandable that members' trust has been shattered. So what happens next? Oh, I'm just going to pause actually, just for a minute, just to point out who the sort of people behind USS, the full-time staff who are advising the trustee on actuarial valuation methods and things like this. I think this is quite an interesting revealing photo in some ways because, again, it's not a photo, it's been manipulated. They've all been photoshopped in so they look like they're weirdly kind of the same height. I get a kind of whiff of, the Nazgul from Lord of the Rings. But in the middle is the chief executive, Bill Galvin. He's come under a lot of scrutiny because his salary has been increasing by a massive amount year on year, despite all the trouble USS has been getting into. And he now earns close to £700,000 a year. It's kind of money which most VCs can only dream of. But I think actually the best paid is the figure just behind him and to his right, Roger Gray, because he's the one who's in charge of investments. And he's one of 2 individuals in USS who accounts reveal, I suspect, it can't be sure, he's one of the 2 individuals in USS whose accounts reveal are paid more than £1 million a year. But what happens next? Well, it's fair to say that employers are not really pushing back against USS's refusal to implement the JEP. Instead, they're currently negotiating over a kind of compromise arrangement, which will keep costs for members quite high, at least for the duration of this valuation cycle. That's the next 2 or 3 years at least. The best outcome of this will be something similar to the first phase of increases we're facing now, but stretched out for the whole of that period, and with a risk of our contributions going up if there's a serious economic downturn during that time. Now, the worst case scenario, in terms of the outcomes of the current negotiations, is that USS insist on keeping costs nearly as high as the third and final phase of the increases that they've already scheduled. And if this happens, I'm afraid to say that if employers' previous behaviour is anything to go by, they will go back to their original plan of trying to cut member benefits. So we have to be ready for that. It's worth pausing and taking stock of the position our employers have taken since they formed the JEP. Now, the JEP showed that their proposal to close the scheme was unnecessary, and, by implication, that the strikes were justified. It also shows that, applied to a 2018 valuation, there is no need for costs to go up. Employers can claim that by law they can't do anything to force these conclusions on USS or the pensions regulator. That's actually a highly debatable claim, but even if it were true, there are still plenty of things they could have done to compensate for the damage they've caused to members. For example, the scheme rules would allow employers to bear the full cost of contribution increases rather than splitting them with members. When they've been asked to do this by UCU, they've refused. Equally, they could repay the millions of pounds in salary deductions which they took from staff who went on strike. This would be much cheaper than bearing the full cost of contribution increases. Again, they've been asked to do this, but they haven't. There comes a point when you have to appreciate that the reasonable evidence-based arguments put forward by experts like the JEP and the many other figures who've weighed in can only take you so far. Employers simply have not been prepared to act on them, even now that they've started to listen and claim that they agree with us. UCU members have already had to learn this lesson over the course of the dispute. It took strike action for employers to withdraw their proposal and agree to set up the JEP in the first place. Without the strike, no amount of arguments would have prevented us from being on a vastly inferior pension plan from this Monday onwards. We may not need to go on strike again, depending on how negotiations play out, but it's a strong possibility, and we need to keep the option on the table. So the moral of the story is that if you want to keep your benefits, and if you want a good retirement income, the only way is to join one of the campus unions. Thanks.